Hello and welcome to part 4 of Intro to VFX Modding. I won't be creating too many things in this video. Instead, I will go over various features and tools in VFX Editor that have not been touched on yet. I will also go over a few scenarios that I've seen trip up modders before. First off, we'll be going over naming and relabeling. Pretty much any field can be given a custom name. Binders, emitter, particles, even the tabs up top. These changes do not break anything in how everything is connected, and if you delete a name from a field, it'll go back to its original name or number that it was before. Overall, a great feature that really helps organization when working on complex effects, and really great when coming back to something you haven't worked on in a while. It should be noted, if you manually export nodes like emitters or timelines, that these labels will not transfer across. To get around this, you can use the library feature, because when you export and import with that, it will keep any of these custom names and labels you have made. For this next part, I will be doing a TMB edit. Some modders find these files intimidating because of their complexity and possibly harmful nature. When working on VFX mods, TMB entries are the only ones that can be considered inherently dangerous because they contain animation locks and character movement data. However, VFX Editor does have proper warnings in place in case you ever wanted to work on these, and there are advanced guides on how to safely edit and swap them around. Outside of those functions, TMBs are fairly safe to edit. Now for custom VFX paths. These are useful for organization and mod options, but can also be used for some effect consolidation. My example will be swapping out a VFX edit I made for triple cast. Now, normally I could just go into the VFX replaced and swap it out. Issue here is that I have two VFX for triple cast, so if I swap out one, the other one will still be showing. I could just swap out one and make the other one edited to be invisible, but that's a little sloppy and still has things spawning. So I'm just going to clear out the replaced and make a new path. VFX spells should start with VFX/. After that, I am making a directory for this mod. Important to always end the effect with .avfx. When I export the mod, this folder structure will be created as this custom path shows here. Next, I will be going into the TMB for triple cast. I want to note that you can preview from TMB Editor as well, and it's sometimes better to do than a VFX preview because it shows the character animation. If you preview things that don't have animations or not made for player models, you can run into some issues, such as your character locking up, T-posing, or even crashing the game. So you want to take a little bit more care with these previews. Now I'll go into the tracks for this. And I'm looking for the VFX entries, which are tracks 2 and 3 right here. These appear to have overall the same settings other than their time start. So what I'm going to do is actually just delete one of them. And on track 2, I am going to put this custom path that I made before. update. And there we go. Another example of how I could have used this is, let's say I have a generic VFX, some sort of slight glow or subtle effect I want to be added onto multiple spells. Instead of copying or importing the effect into each spell, I can add another VFX track and just add these into the TMBs for all the spells that I would like to have this on. Next, I wanted to touch on custom paths for texture. VFX Editor easily enough lets us replace textures or edit them, using this button right here. A very useful one is grayscale, so you can more easily control the color of an effect. The problem is that this texture change will impact everything else in the game that uses that texture. For that reason, we use custom paths so it's only affecting our changed VFX. I'll start with opening the textures window. It is currently empty, but if I wanted to add any custom textures, this is where it happens. I have the option to manually import them if I don't want to swap anything around, and then I can use the path to replace any textures. If I do a quick edit, it preps the texture to be a custom path. Now to give it a custom name. Note how this one changed back, as it no longer has that grayscale bound to it. But if I switch out the new custom path, it is now gray, and this is a custom texture path that will not interfere with the original one. I also wanted to note grayscaling doesn't work on all textures. It usually breaks with ones that have an alpha layer. And in those cases, you need to manually change them by exporting them and changing them in a photo editor program and then importing them back in. For custom textures, another option we have is to apply a custom path to all textures at once. This feature is somewhat new and relates to an Endwalker patch where the game devs changed many in-game texture paths. We don't really know the reason, but the result was a lot of broken VFX mods, and it required the authors to go into each mod and manually updating the texture paths. With convert textures, this can be avoided because all textures are packed into the mod itself. This affects all tabs in a single workspace, so it only needs to be done once. I will advise to only do this when your mod is completely finished, as it is not easy to undo and you may pack in extra textures. The cleanup feature does not remove unused custom path textures either. Now to go over status effects and looped VFX. Depending on how looped VFX is built, you can see entries with kill frames, end frames, unlocks, and resets. Not all of these are needed and depend on how the VFX is built. I would advise checking out in-game examples and referring to the VFX guide in the description for more details. For this example, I'm going to use the Dark Knight status effect, Dark Side. Most loops will use a loop start and end. This can be done at the particle and emitter level, and you may want to use a mix of both depending on what you are creating. When we set the time in here, we are telling the node at what time or the number of frames the loop starts and ends. The other key part is having -1 or endless life setting for items that need to be looping. Depending on where the loop is going, you may need to have this setting on the particles, emitters, timelines, and/or binders. Using this simple VFX, I'm going to quickly demonstrate turning a VFX into a loop. Let's see how it looks to start with. I'm only going to use emitter 0 for this. Emitter 1 is just the sound, so I'm going to remove it. Now I'm going to set the emitter and binder life for -1. Now I'm going to set the loop start and stop. Deciding when to start and end loops can take a lot of trial and error and may require some other edits, so it doesn't look choppy. As we can see here, it does a small burst and then it is a continuous flame now. Next, I will use the library to import this into the DarkSide VFX. Before hitting update or changing anything, I just wanted to see how it looks originally. See a slight red glow around it. And now I will update the timeline to be this new timeline 2 I have. Now let's test it in combat. Alright, looks good. And when the status effect ends for DarkSide, this fire should go away with it. Creating loops like this can also be used for making armor and weapon VFX. You can also build off this to make custom VFX for weapons and armors that do not innately have anything. There are already a few guides for making those, so I won't dive into that subject, but definitely encourage checking those out for more info. Before moving on, I wanted to point out that DarkSide is a status that does have a VFX tied to it. Not all of them do. Status effects like Delirium here do not have a VFX on them and unfortunately cannot have one added onto it. There is still the VFX that comes from the initial cast of it, so if you want, you can extend the duration of this cast to make it last longer throughout the buff. However, it won't be affected by or checking when the status ends early. For these next segments, I wanted to turn to a few issues that can trip up modders. First one is recoloring effects and where to find all the places where colors could be applied. There are quite a few places where colors can be set, so doing detailed recoloring can feel a bit like detective work. First off, we have the parameters tab with the revised colors. It's not used too often for in-game vanilla effects. Next is the particle itself. Depending on the type of particle, there can also be color settings in the data tab, such as color begin and end. Most powders will also have this simple animation effect. This controls the size, movements, and coloring of this particle. Most of these powder effects with simple animation I would describe as small glitter-like or sparkle effects. These have their own set of colors that can be set at different time frames for when each powder spawns, and this is also influenced by the main color for the particle. Textures also commonly influence a particle's colors. On the emitters, we can see influence on child color. That would mean we need to check the emitter's color settings for changing the VFX colors as well. Next, we have models themselves. Like textures, the color of these models can influence the look of a VFX. It should be noted the brightness on the models can do a lot to influence the look of a particle as well. In most cases, all parts of a model that are white are where texture can go across, with grays having the texture faded or opaque, and the black is where the texture can't be seen at all. Last place for color settings is in the TMBs for a spell. This is basically the same as the revised colors in the parameter tab, but it also lets you control the alpha. I'm not aware of any in-game effects that have this modified, but that does not mean it won't be used in the future, and it's something you can utilize yourself. Next topic I wanted to go over was spells not following a target or caster as long as they should. I haven't edited VFX to demonstrate these issues. Most of the time, this can be attributed to the life setting somewhere or emitter influence. I have set all these particles to last for about 4 seconds, but I have some that follow for 1 second or not at all. First off is the emitter. When particle's life ends, the particle just disappears, but that is not the case for emitters. Instead, it just stops applying its effects to the particle. So I'm going to start with updating the life there. Also updating it on the timeline as well. Still not following. Next, I'm going to check the binder life. Make sure that is long enough as well. Okay, almost all of the particles are following now. Have some that still aren't. Checking the emitter, I see that there are some that are set for all initial instead of all always. I can also use child influence with these options right here in case I wanted the emitter to only affect its position and not its scale or rotation. And there we go. It's following as it should. Another setting that can cause following issues is the coordinate update frame field. This controls how often the game should update the VFX based on the binder's position. Some spells have this for 0 or other values that will throw off a VFX from following. In these instances, you just need to change the field to -1 and it should clear up. Last, for VFX binding, I wanted to go over the bind points in the TMB. These basically control how a binder is used in the VFX. These do not need to be edited as often if you are just swapping cast or spell effects, but if you are putting VFX on weapons or other targets, you may need to adjust these. Check out the TMB notes for the full details on them. I also wanted to go over finding the paths of files. Not all can be found with simple searching. Sometimes there is an effect that is not yet listed, or one that is hard to track down. Penumbra has a resource logger tab that will display all paths of VFX as they go off. There's also a plugin you can find in download mode called Reslogger or Reslogger, not sure how to pronounce that, but using a spell will have these show up. They both also have the option to narrow down what you're searching for so you can find paths easier. The VFX editor and TMB editor also have an option for this, just showing them on screen. You just have to click the eyeball button in the top right and it will display the paths. And with that, we conclude part 4 of Intro to VFX Modding and the end to the series. While I know there is a lot that was not covered, I believe the information in these videos sets a good foundation for anyone starting off. Early on, I feel it's very beneficial to just go through random VFX and see how they work. I also want to reiterate that many of the edits I have done in these videos are not the only way to go about making these VFX. There are many ways to edit, and there is no right way for most situations. Thank you again to my fellow modders and the students of Baldessian for helping me make this series.